I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce to you Professor Ron Wakkary, who's just joined us there from Eindhoven University of Technology. Ron is professor in the School of Interactive Arts and Technology and founder of the Everyday Design Studio at Fraser University in Canada, which is where Ron and I first met when Ron chaired the ACM Designing Interactive Systems Conference in 2014, I believe. And he's also now a professor and chair of Design for More Than Human-Centered Worlds and Industrial Design at Eindhoven University of Technology, and he's joining us from Eindhoven. So originally, I had anticipated that Ron might be in Vancouver, and I've been tagging him as our opening keynote because of the time zone difference. And I said, no, I'm going to be in Europe. So we had to mix things around, and now he's our closing keynote. So I'm really, really pleased to introduce to you Ron, who's just also, as I mentioned earlier, published the book, What We Could Design for More Than Human-Centered Worlds. It's come out with MIT Press. Ron, we can see your slides already. We got a little thumbnail of you in the corner. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Excellent. We're really looking forward to your presentation, and ideally, if we leave some time at the end for some Q&A, then we'll have some interaction with the audience online and here in the room.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Okay, you want me to start then? So thank you very much, Marcus. So as Marcus mentioned, I'm here in Eindhoven, in the Netherlands, but when I'm not here, I live and work on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, in a place otherwise known as Vancouver in Canada. And as Marcus mentioned, today I'm going to talk to you about this book that I wrote and recently was released recently. And I've been giving, as you can imagine, just a number of talks on this, but I decided in discussions with Marcus and hearing what you were going to talk about, and I understand you've had a very lively discussion already today, and I regret that I wasn't able to be there, but I look forward to your questions later. But in discussing this with Marcus, I sort of did a slight twist to the talk, and to ask to take what I wrote in the book and to put it in the end as a series of asks. And actually this mirrors what I do in the book in the last chapter, when I take a step back and I say, well, what are the various asks of designers and those around designers? And I do that in the last chapter, but here I have not done it in the talk. So this is customized. Okay, wait. So let's go. So the book, Things We Could Design for More Than Human-Centered World. It's a post-human investigation of design, and really just trying to, I think, make clear the notion that we share center stage, so to speak, with non-humans. And this is really not simply a material matter, not simply an ethical matter, but an existential matter for us to consider and work from as a principle. The book aims to theorize a practice of what I call designing with. And in this notion of designing with, I make the good of designing with to better cohabit, and not just our world, but to cohabit a more than human world. So this was the goal of the book. And in many respects, it was over the years, partly my own, in large part my own design research, but also thinking about where my understanding of design was really lacking and leaving me in a place where I needed to know more. Someone says the slides are not working. Is that clear? Marcus, am I moving forward on the slides? It should be theorize a practice of designing.
We are seeing your whole screen. So it's showing us what I believe is Keynote, the whole Keynote window.
The whole Keynote window, as in presenter mode.
No, it's not in presenter mode. It's just in edit mode.
Oh, okay. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. Then I think the share was, let's try to do this properly.
Heather in
I
the
think
chat is
we're,
saying you might need to reshare the presenter screen. Yes,
is that
looks
any better?
better. Yes, now we're seeing a black slide with
Okay.
theorize a practice of designing.
Yes.
Great.
Okay, so that, okay, wonderful. So, trying to go back actually. So this is the slide you missed, which was the book that I was talking about.
Yep.
And then I spoke about the aim of the book. And so thinking about what it was in design, in large part, I felt that I was at least unprepared to understand or to conceive of or to articulate as a designer. So let me give you an example of that, or an issue, or I guess my issue, so to speak. This is a patent and by Sten Gustaf Thulin, who is an industrial designer with a Swedish company known as Celloplast. And this patent is in 1965. And even though it's a patent, I think it comes to represent a good idea of what we tend to call the design problem. And in some sense, a response or a solution, an elegant solution to the design problem. So what this patent shows is taking a roll of polyethylene, folding it over once and welding it into a large tube, and then cutting this tube and welding the seams into rectangles. And then a third move of simply cutting out the top of the rectangles to create these arms. As you can well imagine, or maybe have figured it out, this is the ubiquitous plastic bag that thankfully is making its way out of stores, but for the longest time has been there. And of course, the goal here was to create a convenient way that people could carry their groceries from the store to their car. So for about 10 to 15 minutes of use. But it was seen as an elegant solution because it required few moves, few moves of manipulation, easily accessible material, easy to scale up and to manufacture. And of course, many companies actually fought over this patent. But we know the real story, of course, of the plastic bags. I mean, this is just one image of one of the Pacific garbage patch, but the numerous such garbage patches floating around in the vortexes or of any one of our oceans. And the question really for me was clearly the weakness and the challenge and how problematic the notion of the design problem is, but how do we conceive of this? How do we conceptualize this for designers as a way to think of this in its totality is what is the thing that is designed. So in pursuing that, theoretically, I do arrive at a number of concepts, and there are three in particular that I want to talk about today, but I want to signal them up front because there's a small journey to get there, and that is biography, constituency, and nomadic practices. So that will be in some sense the destiny of this discussion. Or the destination. Did I say destiny? Sorry. And I think, stepping back, if we look at the externalities or the issues that really face us, and I think we probably discussed much of this today, so I won't spend too much time on it. But I want to think past human-centered design, but human-centered design is rooted in the era and the moment that that we're all still immersed in, this era of humanism. And the value of human exceptionalism. This is the image by Leonardo da Vinci of the Vitruvius Man. It's the application of the Vitruvius's architectural proportions, the perfect architectural proportions applied to the human body, which speaks to the Western European philosophical project of the last few centuries of really this progression, idealization, and perfection of not just the human, but human reason. And the sense that if once perfection of human reason is achieved, then that will bode well for all and all on this planet. Of course, we know the legacy of this. We know what this has brought upon us, so to speak. Firstly, that the division between humans and nature, making nature a place of exploitation where we can extract and mine for all that it is worth for our own convenience. And of course, the series of mass extinctions of which are ongoing now of other species. But even the notion of who would be seen to be amongst those that could participate in the project of humanism, that not all humans were considered potential to be perfect humans, that this violent history of colonization and racism and the distinctions between less than human, uncivilized, brown, and black, that has really been the legacy of humanism. But together with this period in which we have focused so much on what it is to be human and the perfection of human reason, and our understanding of our effect and our dominion in the world that we're in, we live in the same era of the Anthropocene, in which we were oblivious, in fact, to the real effect of our inhabiting this planet, the scale of that effect, the idea that humans have actually affected the world on at a geological scale. And for example, Bruno Latour, I mean, there are many tragedies with the notion of the Anthropocene, and Bruno Latour adds to this one that when we just realize what we have done, it's all but over. So within this context is really the move away from humanism, for me, moving to an understanding of posthumanism and using and this notion of post-human theories. And there's a lot there, and I weave in the book the philosophical theories of posthumanism together with design to rethink and what I call unbuild human-centered design and its attachments to humanism. I won't go over all of that here, but I think that there's one key concept that will help, I hope, help you understand where I'm going and how I'm trying to think of this practice of designing things or to design with, and that's relationality. And so relationality is this notion that what in posthumanism you might call a relational ontology, that everything is in relation to something else. Unlike in humanism, where things are defined as autonomous and fixed, and we can have such separations as humans and nature and humans and non-humans, in posthumanism, through relationality, the separation is really not possible. But it also opens up to a kind of dynamic relationality, as we know that relations are fairly complex, and really opens us up or puts at the foundation a notion of an ecological form of thinking, an interdependence with the world around us, and therefore consideration of our world as more than human. So I bring this into design through a number of themes, and I'm going to share those themes with you now. The first of which is this idea that humans and things are interconnected and agentic. And so in working through the principles of relationality, this notion that in humanism, where we may have separated things and technologies from us, really there has been a long-standing, for almost as long as we've been human, this interconnectedness between us and things, this co-constitution, this defining of each other. This is a project called Phototrope. It's actually an illuminated running shirt by the fashion tech designer Pauline van Dongen, who recently completed her PhD at Eindhoven. And what this shows is the very notion of what it is to be a runner is in large part interconnected with the very technologies of running. And we shall include clothing as part of that. So whether it's simply the clothing that manages our body temperature by wicking away sweat, or the very look of that clothing that creates an element of performance. And in this case, with the phototrope, this illumination that allows us to be seen and allows the runner to see their environment around them. And this is what constitutes a nocturnal runner, a night runner. And this shaping of this interconnectedness, so we can't think of a night runner without such technology or without some kind of illumination that's really a part of their body. In many respects, this is what Donna Haraway meant when she said, we are already cyborgs. That in fact, there is this interconnectedness is what makes us in the world, the ability to act in this world, but it's a relational action. It goes beyond functionality. And there's another phrase that I like quite a bit, which is by Carrie Wolf, the notion that we are prosthetic creatures. This is an example of what's known as the prayer companion, which is this burgundy object on the screen that by Bill Gaver, the Interaction Research Studio, in which it brings need from the internet of news for cloistered nuns to use at prayer time. But beyond the computational device, we can think of the clothing, we can think of the architecture, the clothing like the habits or the architecture itself and the various other artifacts as prosthetic creature, as us being prosthetic creatures of religion or spirituality, that this interconnectedness runs deep and it's transformative or shapes us. But this interconnectedness is not without its contestations. It's not something that is simply a harmonious kind of evolution. This is something that we're constantly in relation to, and constantly there are moments of resistance and moments and layers upon layers of interconnectedness. So this is a project by called New Faces, New Identities by Sal Baeza that helps to show this, where he had designed facial prosthetics, so quite literally prosthetics, and not designed to be wearables in the sense of fashion, for facial recognition systems. So the ability to, through these prosthetics, to create identities, to change identities, to obscure your own identity as the identity that's seen through the technology of facial recognition systems. But this interconnectedness with technology and the degree to which, or things, and the degree to which it's fundamental shouldn't come to us as a surprise, as we're not the only prosthetic creatures on this planet. This is a research by Sarah Gelbert that, in short, reveals or shows, describes how crows, in some sense, can design things to manipulate their environment around them. And here they're actually designing tokens to operate a vending machine that she had built. But in this interconnectedness of things and in these layers, as I talked about with sort of new faces and new identities, there is a real agentic quality that clearly the things shape us, but things interconnect with each other. We think about them in a broader relational scale as a networks or assemblages. This is a new prototype. It's called Lichtline Plus here in the Netherlands. I'll spare you the guessing game. This is a traffic light for those on mobile phones. So if you're walking down the street on your mobile phone, you don't have to look up and you can see whether the light is green or whether the light is red. Now, the question to which this is desirable is certainly something we can discuss. But when I bring this up, and this actually was discussed when it was brought up, this idea that oh, we're feeding the technological addiction of those people, or it's separating us from our physical reality, when in fact, I think it is really just revealing the interconnectedness that we have with things and our adaptations as we go. But really the point here I want to show is the way that things, in a sense, together interact with other things to, in some sense, have agency, to create new things. So in many ways, this Lichtline Plus is really no different than when we are encased in a car as a cyborg driving the road and needing a traffic light, or on a bicycle and again, utilizing a traffic signal, or as a pedestrian clothed crossing the street. And here, one with a mobile phone. But so that's the interconnectedness, but it's actually as if the mobile phone traffic light was in some sense designed by the trajectories, the agency, if you like, of the assemblage. And it's not the one designer of the Lichtline Plus, but in fact, it is the agency across the assemblage or the network of the traffic intersection. Now, in thinking about how things have an effect, I purposely didn't separate those things that are animate from those that are inanimate, living matter versus those we may consider to be not living matter. We can all see them in some sense as having an agentic capacity in a more than human way. This is a portrait of Roger van der Weyden. This is one of the many Northern Renaissance portraits you would see. This was during the Burgundy era. And in many of these portraits, they're really quite dark. And there are very few, it seems almost austere, and it seems odd because we know these are people of wealth, they're people of power, and yet this is how it seems odd, this is the way they display their wealth and their power and their privilege. Yet what is actually being displayed here is the color black in the wool that they are wearing. It's a very specific black, which was known as Burgundian black. And it was so specific that they would at the time have judges or auditors. Is everything working, Marcus? Yeah. So at the time they would have.
Sorry, I just lowered the lights a little bit so it's easier to see your slides.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So of course, this is Burgundian black, so it's quite dark. So at the time, they had judges or auditors that would assess the color of the black to be sure it truly was Burgundian black, that it wasn't a lesser black or it wasn't a knockoff or a fake black, that was the degree to which they're after this very, very specific black. And many of the guilds that made these, of course, kept their recipes a secret, jealously guarded it from others. And so over the time, the recipes and the formulations and the processes to make Burgundian black were lost. This is a photo of Claudia Youngstra. She's a textile artist in Northern Holland. I was lucky enough to visit her studio. She is part of a research project that is reconstructing or reinventing, so to speak, the processes and the recipes to make Burgundian black. And Claudia is an amazing textile artist and also really thinks about she doesn't consider herself a more than human textile artist, but I would see her in that context, in the sense that she raises her own sheep that she uses uses for her wool. Outside her studio is a large garden that she grows all of the vegetation that she uses in her vegetable dyes. And in her formula or a recipe for Burgundian black, it involves indigo or woad plant. So to make Burgundian black, you need 2 layers. It's a two dye process. And so the first one is done with indigo, and you need to take the woad, and it needs to be fermented for 3 to 4 months. And then depending on the water and on the weather, it needs to be carefully watered. And this gives you the blue. And over top, you want a red dye. And this is made from the root here that you can see in this picture of what's known as a madder plant. And that root ideally, well, at minimum should be 3 to 5 years old, but ideally would be 10 to 12 years old. And then the root itself needs to be dried for an additional 2 years. And it's in that process that the fermentation and the dye making can begin. So we can see that there are these various life forces or organic matter and processes that are very much part of and contribute and are collaborators or in cooperation or in sympathy with the idea of Burgundian black. And it's through these processes that's the only way in which you could arrive at this very particular color. Whether animate or inanimate, these kind of agentic qualities is what Diana Kuhl and Jane Bennett call agentic capacities. And the value of that is we can start to see how non-humans as well as humans share agentic capacities, that there is a better way in which we can understand the relationality of how there's an effect on the world. They may be differing effects, but they're still effects that in some sense are related to each other. The next theme that I want to talk about is to apply this notion of relationality specifically to the idea of design and designing things, but then to make clear or to note that in fact, when things are relational, they need to be negotiated, that meanings are not fixed, and hence they ultimately become political. This is an image close to where I am in Vancouver. It's from a blockade, which is a protest, which is close to where I'm in Vancouver. It's on Vancouver Island. It's known as Fairy Creek. It's in fact been the largest and the longest protest in Canada. These are protesters that are blocking the road to prevent the harvesting of old growth trees. And it's clear the old growth trees have a particular set of meanings in relation to various groups. And in many respects, the protesters and the activists here are making a matter of concern around what are the matters that are important to us, the values of old growth trees and our relations to them, in which the authorities, which are clearly divided here and obvious to see in many ways distinguished through the things that they are a part of, the very cyborgian forms that they take. But clearly the authorities lag behind, I think, the relational meaning that many of us hold for things like old growth trees and forest. This is what these things, human and non-human things, are really what have these politics attached to them, what Bruno Latour calls matters of concern. Now, in thinking about this in design, we engaged in a project. This is a project of mine, and it's an object that I made what I call a counterfactual artifact, which is something that you would not normally design. And there's an element of which that is counterfactual. So this is actually called a tilting bowl. And it is as the name suggests, it is a large ceramic bowl that on occasion tilts. this nonsensical or counterfactual element of the tilt creates a what if space, and a way to kind of a new set of conditions in which you have to try to understand, well, how can this thing exist? What are the conditions by which it exists? And to examine or to research this, we have people live with the things we make for, in this case, the tilting bowl, people lived with it. Actually, it's philosophers is who we just asked to live with this. They lived with it for more than 2 years. And it was a way for us to try to examine and understand the relationality of things. This is an image from, so as I said, we had philosophers live with the tilting bowl for up to 2 years, and then we would interview them. We would go and interview them every month or so. And in one interview, there were 2 philosophers that lived with this tilting bowl, and they were showing us something that they had made, which they called a tilting trap, wanting to know, well, does it tilt? Did it tilt when they were not in the room? And so they put a tin cup in the middle, and they put a piece of paper against it so that if it tilted, they would know, they would hear it, or the paper would, in theory, fall over, and they would know that it had tilted. And so this was just them trying to reflect and understand, well, what is the nature of this bowl? Now we returned several weeks later, and this tilting trap of theirs came up again, but they had something very different to say about it. They said, politically, think about that politically. That's the way refugees are treated sometimes. The same kind of surveillance with the bowl, the same suspicion exactly. Now one might think, how does one go from a ceramic bowl, one that tilts, and the silliness of something that tilts, so something as mundane as a bowl and the silliness of something that tilts, to ideas of surveillance through what they had made, but yet this is the very negotiation and relationality of meaning that happens, in which this tilting bowl is now connected to notions of surveillance through the trap that they made, and they found themselves complicit within that. And the relations they had to the tilting bowl is something that was not human, that was less than human, was connected to the notions of migrants and refugees that were seen or treated as less than human. And in many respects, this is just one of many examples of the way in which things around us, non-humans in particular, become political, things to be negotiated. In post-phenomenology, this relationality is called multistability, that things have multiple stabilities. So if we take a public bench, you can certainly sit on it, that's one stability. You can lie on it is another. You can hide underneath it. You can stand on top of it and use it as a stage. So everything has this multistability, or has this potentiality for multiplicity of relations. But more than not, in public benches, we see design features such as armrest that are put on there in theory, or seemingly to aid those who want to sit on a bench. But for those who, particularly the unhoused or the homeless, know this to be a feature that prevents them from using the bench for lying down on. This is something that closes down on the stabilities. It reduces the relationalities of a thing. It's what Robert Rosenberger calls a callous object. And callous in the sense that here, an object that is presented as an amenity in public space, as something of a social collective function, is actually used to exclude others from what is public, to discipline and police what is public. This is perhaps one of the clearest examples of this, which is the Camden Bench in London, just across from the Freemasons Temple in Camden Borough. It's billed as the anti-skateboarding bench because of its shape, that it's hard to skateboard off of. The anti-graffiti bench, that it's coated so that graffiti can be easily removed. The anti-theft bench, it has no ways in which you can perhaps grab a bag from behind because there's no openings on the bench. It's seen as, of course, an anti-homeless bench because it's not comfortable to lie on, and it's come to be seen as an anti-terrorism bench. And really what this is the classic example, is a good example of shutting down on the relationalities and the stabilities, and politically determining what is meant by public. But like all things political, they're open to contestation and negotiation. And sure enough, there is a Camden Bench skateboard trick. So these politics of occlusion, as Robert Rosenberg calls this idea that we are designing things to hide or to negate or to obscure the politics that are at hand, the politics of our relations with things that are more than human. So this brings me now, the screen is intentionally black, so just that's not a technical issue. This brings me now to the three concepts that I wanted to share with you, and each of which I've attached an ask. So really these concepts about, well, given this understanding, this more than human understanding of the things that we design, how do we approach this to achieve what I wanted, which was this idea of the good of cohabiting our more than human world? So the first of these concepts is the notion of biography. Now in design, designers understand that the things that they design are often attached to their biography. They become known for this thing that they have designed. But that's in some sense a weak sense of biography. I wanted to put this term into a post-human or more than human context. So the way I see it is actually the designers design something that share a bios, bio meaning life, that they share the life forces. If we think about the interconnectedness of things with us, we can't think of the designer as exclusively human, but the designer is always operating in concert and sometimes in contest with more than human things that have their own agentic capacities. And so this idea of a shared bios, I think, comes through in this notion of biography. And that shared bios is a particular relation when it comes to designing. So if we think, I use the metaphor of a kite, which I borrow in part from Tim Ingold, to illustrate this notion. So think about a designer that may say, or someone who may say, I want to fly a kite, and they bring the kite to the beach and they unfurl the kite and they run down the beach and it lifts up. But at that point, they're not flying the kite alone. They're flying the kite with the air pressure, with the air temperature, with the wind, with the materials of the kite, with the strength of the rope, with the shape of the kite. So there is in concert this shared agentic capacity in which as the human at the end of the string, you can't guide exactly what the flight path is, but you need to work through this shared choreography, this work in concert with, in one in which you don't fully know what's going to happen and you're not fully in control, but yet you're negotiating and navigating and literally flying with more than humans. And in that sense is why I think about design as designing with humans and non-humans. But that's only one part of the notion of biography, this shared bios. The second aspect, of course, is the graphy or the writing. And in design, this is a way for us to think about what in this shared bios, this between humans and non-humans that become part of the thing designed, what is it that we inscribe in the world and how is that inscribed into the world? But also, all biographies end at some point. So what is left behind in the things that are designed? And often the things we design, there's an ongoing sets of ends, if you like, or deaths that the human designer might often die much before the thing itself as it continues to exist. And how do we account for that? How do we think about that as we design and the way in which the things themselves and shape and are reshaped? This brings me back to the notion of the thinking about Sten Gustav Thulen's patent and what we know happened to the plastic bag, thinking about the shared bios of working with plastics, the toxicity, the inherent toxicity of that plastic, the ease of availability of that plastic, the ease to scale up, the ease of distribution, not only to be passed from person to person, but be picked up in the wind. And of course, the life force that it is of a non-human temporality of 10,000 years or more to biodegrade in various forms. This is the shared bios. This is what is inscribed into the world, and this is what is left behind. And so I actually, in the book, came to describe this not as a biography, but as an anti-biography. And in many ways, unfortunately, much of what we design are anti-biographies in that sense that they're anti-life. They're not the worlds that we want to cohabit. We know we're in a world that we, through the convenience of using weather apps and other apps on our phone, we now exist in a world of data surveillance and data capitalism that can move from dictatorship to global economies to create vast asymmetries and vast exploitation and vast harm. But there are ways to think about biographies, as I describe them, as biographies, not as anti-biographies. This is what's called the Children's Village, which is a dormitory for a remote school in northern Brazil by the architectural firm Aleph Zero and the designer Marcelo Rosenbaum. And it's designed firstly with very few elements. The wood is eucalyptus that was brought to Brazil in the 19th century and is local to this region. And so that's the main material, the supports, the vertical supports for the building. The bricks are made of the sand and the dirt and the soil from the area when they were able to form mud bricks. And of course, there's the corrugated corrugated metal of the rooftop that will eventually oxidize. But this is already beginning to think of what are the shared life forces that you want to bring into the thing that you design. And then how it inscribes itself in the world in relation to others. It's an open architecture that allows for temperature and climate to be controlled by the world outside as much as the world inside, and using humidity of ponds and so on to manage the well-being of those inside. But thinking about what is left behind when this becomes not inhabited anymore. And of course, we know the eucalyptus and the bricks will simply return to the environment that they were already a part of, that they're already and always have been cohabiting, and the metal will eventually rust. So there's a way of thinking about the biography of the things that we design. And so in some sense, this ask, and I think it can be applied in many ways, but can designing be seen as shared more than human biography that is attuned to its ongoing inscriptions into the world and what is left behind? The next concept that I want to talk about is constituency, and this in part addresses the interconnectedness and the shared agencies and the need to think about cohabiting, but also the politics that I had discussed that were inherent to things that we design, or the things in the world. And in many ways, as I showed with the patent and the design problem is really designed to create a space in which the designer can know and the designer can solve things. But in doing so, it excludes so much. And in large part, it excludes the politics of the very act of bringing something into the world. And it puts those off to others to deal with through regulation or through government policy or through activism, and not seen to be part of the act of designing something. So how can we do this differently? And this is the notion of constituency. The way I see it is the need for, in relation, I also talked about in the book that in terms of biographies and constituencies, that the human designer is what I call the speaking subject, one that speaks on behalf of itself and aims to elicit the participation, in some sense, speak on behalf of mute things, mute non-humans that have inability or don't speak in the same way. But nevertheless, the speaking subject in this sense is the one who gathers humans and non-humans together to consider what kind of designer might be needed and what kind of something it is that we want to design. And based on whatever affinities that this particular gathering might have, or whatever necessities that this particular gathering might have. I like to think of a constituency like a kitchen. So if you think about a kitchen, it's a gathering of non-humans, of the ingredients and the materials that we might use. It's a gathering of different things, the cooking technologies that we use. It's a gathering of place. It's a gathering of the air. It's a gathering of the climate. Of course, it's a gathering of people. But it also relates itself to its own heritage, to its own ethnicities, to its own cultures. But it negotiates matters related to those, but also explicit ones of politics, such as, is this a non-GMO kitchen? Is this a vegan kitchen? What kind of kitchen are we going to have? What is the gathering? What is the affinities that bring us all together? What is the some things that we actually want to cook? And all of this is done before we have a cook. And all of this is done before a meal is cooked. And this is the way I would like to start to think about design, shifting to the collective structures by which we design, before we design. But this gathering is what Jane Bennett would call a political ecology of humans and non-humans. So the need to work through and negotiate within your set of affinities or the proximities or what constitutes the gathering, what exactly it is that's important in a more than human sense, and that allows the participation of non-humans. Now, we have the beginnings of this in design. This studios, this is my own studios, however, pays far less attention to thinking about it in relation to a more than human context. In a book, I talk about the collective life patch from Yogyakarta, Indonesia. And this is in the global north, was seen as a DIY collective. However, in Indonesia, it was really spoken of as a do it with others collective. And this notion of do it with others extended beyond those people in the collective was actually a generational practice. They linked it to the maternal lineage to their mothers and grandmothers who in fact not only took care of villages or kampungs as they were called through do it with other activities, always thinking about how can we do something not alone but with others. But this with others extended to non-humans. To thinking in Yogyakarta, the main project for the Light Patch Collective was working with the Yogyakarta River. And so getting the participation of the river, the water, the bacteria, many other projects had to do with fermentation or the use of water as a resource, and would bring in different aspects and all the relations that would be formed within this collective. And in many ways, much of the activity was before any activity would really start, was in what was the collective, who was part of that collective, human and non-human, and what were the goals, or what were some things that they wanted to enact in the world. More recently, this is an installation that was at Dutch Design Week, which I saw, which was quite marvelous. It's a project by Studio McKink & By. It's what they call the Water School, which is a project in a neighborhood in Rotterdam where they work collectively around a school of water, and where they think about the participation of all those related to the notion of how water is used and utilized and contributes and is a partner in that neighborhood. And this will include working with wastewater, for example, as not only a participant in the water school, but something that they design with. So they ask for this, and I've focused this on design education, where I think we tend to think about designers, when we educate designers, as first of all, individuals rather than collectively. And we tend to focus on what is the thing they're going to design rather than how they're going to design. Or when we talk about how they're going to design, we talk about this in terms of methods or processes, but can we work more fundamentally and think about shifting attention to young designers toward the collective structures by which they're designed, so they can really act on the motivations and the values that bring them into the idea of designing, and find themselves equally able to determine what structures they design by, rather than just accepting the structures that already exist. The last concept I want to talk about is nomadic practices. In fact, this is the first thing I talk about in the book. In thinking about, I characterized what I do in the book as a critical and creative speculation. And if I wanted to think about a post-human design project, the last thing I wanted to do was do this through humanist means or through humanist thinking. And in large part, the idea of design, think about it as an abstraction on its own, is seen as a humanist discipline. It's one of many disciplines as part of the humanist project of dividing up the knowledge of the world into disciplines that each can be perfected and then collectively contribute to the humanist project. But this discipline is structured in a way that's hierarchical. It has foundations, and we know within our own design discipline that there are lesser designs and so hierarchies and sub-hierarchies. But more than not, there's a foundation that really weighs upon the discipline as singular. And so in the critical and creative speculation, I wanted to make space. I didn't want to do battle with human-centered design. And I'm not going to argue this is the next thing, because it's just only going to fall prey to the thing that comes later. But to really rethink design and think about it in terms of being of multiplicity and expansiveness and focusing on the differences. So seeing design not as a singular discipline, but as a series of concurrent and intersecting and very different nomadic practices. So in the book, I open up a space for myself by looking at existing design and rethinking them as nomadic practices. So designing artifacts, which are about progressing sort of the way in which you think about this in human-computer interaction as supporting human use. Designing objects as a kind of aesthetic, moral approach to designing things. And of course, the world of capitalism that we're very much a part of, this designing of products for capitalist production. And of course, they intersect, but they're all distinctly different. But this opened up the ability for me to talk about designing things and to think about this in a more fundamental way of our interconnectedness and the relationality between us and things, and what might that be for design. And if I kind of return to my kitchen metaphor, the notion of nomadic practices is one in which anybody can claim to be designing something, as in anyone can be claimed to cook something. That there is a generosity, a multiplicity, and expansiveness about cooking. There's no one way to cook. There's a cooking that's rooted in place. There's cooking that's rooted in ethnicity. There's a cooking that's rooted in the very more than human collaborators and partners that we bring and gather in our kitchen. And so in this kind of multiplicity, can we think about the way in which we approach design? And in fact, I think when I mean, right now, I think it's actually in some ways more dangerous than ever when many people are actually talking about the need for a more universal design education. This notion that singularity is what's going to be required to tackle the most complex matters that would face us as climate change and Anthropocene and systemic racism. Although I would argue exactly the opposite, that we need as many resources and we need as many people claiming to be able to act in the world through designing something in order to tackle these larger issues. So my last ask is, can designing be seen as inexhaustibly pluralistic? So thank you for listening, and thank you for bearing through all the technical difficulties, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Amazing. I'm going to turn the lights back on. Thank you, Ron. That was really, really great. Without you knowing, I assume, because unless you've been secretly surveilling our proceedings here, you've actually managed to, in a very interesting manner, provide an amazing summary of the entire day. We started off with an opening keynote by Mary Graham, that focused on relationality and the relational ethos in Aboriginal cultures and epistemologies. And we've also had quite a bit of discussion around design and activism, as well as collaborative and collective practices. So there's so much that resonates with the kinds of discussions and discourse that we've had today. So it's been amazing. I know it's late in the day here and early there. I do want to start us off with a question around the kitchen metaphor that you've used, which I find really intriguing. And I want to ask you about the notion of institutioning, because in a way, the way that design practice, design studios have been critiqued is in a way by thinking of it as its own world, its own space, where designers create their own rules. They create the rules of inclusivity, of participation, of diversity, and the world is a happy place inside the kitchen. But that's not actually reality. So part of the criticism is that if we want the creative process of the design to come to the fore into the real world, we eventually need to build those interfaces and bridges with more institutional structures, and considering that in its own right a design process, which kind of is how I think of institutioning as a journey and as an endeavor. How do you reconcile these kinds of I suppose challenges when it comes to the asks of designers and how they might need to be translated by graduates actually entering the real world, as our university often refers to it, as entering industry and government jobs, for instance?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's a complicated one. I don't think there's, but I do think that, and I do think there is this awareness, as you said, about, I think, institutionalizing and designing our institutions and our organizations. But I wonder to what degree we run the risk of turning these into objectives of design rather than the necessities of what it means to cohabit our world. And I do think this idea, I think that there's so what I was trying to do with the idea of constituency is make it integral to the notion, to the ideas of designing, that it's equally important, the collective structures by which we design and the experimentation and the plurality of that. So that this is something that is not taken for granted, but I think is also seen as something that is needed, is the very infrastructure in a sense that's needed to do the act of designing in the way you want to do. So I think it becomes, and maybe it's just a slight shift of attention, and maybe it's a slight shift of emphasis. And I think to make that a necessity, I mean, there's one thing, as if sometimes I think when people talk about designing organizations, it's as if the notion of designing already precedes the idea that we then might think about, oh, now we're going to apply it to organizational culture or organizational structures. when in fact the very organization by which we design also needs to be examined, and then that becomes part of integral practice, and it makes much more sense when you apply it. And I think it's one of the notions that I think in this book that can be applied in various ways, given the different commitments people might have to the way in which to what they read in the book. Maybe you're very much within industry, but it doesn't necessarily mean you don't think about the collective structures. And this is very much happening now. We have this odd phrase of activism, corporate activism within Google, but I think it's necessary to have this kind of thing. The other point I wanted to make was I think that, we really need to not lower the bar, but we need to validate the claims for different collective structures. There almost seems to be a bar before we can start talking about something as being institutional or something as being accredited. And I talk about this a lot in the book, about how we can, at least from a notion of what do we consider in an academic sense to be a valid practice in a design sense. And I think we need to open that up and open up to that kind of plurality and let people make claims based on who they gather and the thing that they design. But I think this can be scaled up in a myriad of different practices that are really quite different, and each one in their own right paying attention to the collective structures by which they're doing what they wanted to do.
Thank you, Ron. We got a question here from Alice Payne.
Oh, thanks so much, Ron, for a really fascinating talk. And as you were talking, I was reflecting on how you've got this identification between objects and things, and I guess and then products, of course. And it makes me think when we do. So I'm from fashion, by the way, and so the thingness of things really interests me. They come from the stuff of the earth. They're grown, or they're fossil fuels of ancient times, and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So. Thinking about what capitalism does really well, which is take, these beautiful, poetic, stimulating ideas from the margins that ask us to think about the world differently, and then suck it back into itself and commodify it. I kind of think to myself, how will the more than human, how can we avoid this kind of co-opting that happens where it is reduced to a surface aesthetic? It's just another marketable gloss of, oh, let's feel connected to nature, and it's just stripped of all critique and all power through that. And I don't know the answer, but I'm curious as to if you have thoughts on how do we, I guess, fight that co-option that so often happens.
Yeah, and I think clearly, that's a massive. It's clearly of a scale and effort that it needs to invite as many people as possible through many different backgrounds and activities as possible. But I will say, in fact, I think that we now talk about more than human, and I talk about this in the book, that in many ways, actually, the co-optation has long begun. I think that in many ways, industry and capitalism has already understood what I call the agentic capacities, the ability for effect of things that are not human. We can look at this in the technological sense of AI, for example, or we can look at this in the massive industry scale conversion of forest into tree farms. This is something that's been going for some time, this yielding not just extraction of passive materials, but yielding the capacity and the agency of things. And this is why I wanted to really make clear that this distinction between biographies and anti-biographies, and that we live in a world of anti-biographies. And I agree careful about the way in which we now think that we are designing with nature, when in fact we've always been designing with nature in an extractive sense. And what is that fine line between something that we can extract in so-called a renewable way versus what does it mean to cohabit, which is why I use that term cohabit. But I wanted to really come back to this. I think to me, that was the importance of thinking through this idea of constituency and bringing politics. And I was really actually thinking about design education, even though I didn't really talk about it that way, but the need to think about how we organize to design, and in different ways, as I've already covered, but to bring in that notion of resistance in politics, to shift the language away from innovation. Change is not just innovation. We should be very suspicious. That's clear co-optation. But I think this notion, bringing back to ideas of resistance, bringing back to critical generosity. And I think it's just, we need, and I think why I guess I think about education was we need to, and I think about this in design, is we need to unbuild and rebuild the whole design practice completely, or give us the space for people to experiment with rebuilding it from the way we've done it, or unbuilding it, as I called it. You can only hope that a project like this, in a process of multiplicity, a process of differences, and one that engages and empowers and enables more, where resistance in politics is foregrounded in the understanding of the practice, that's perhaps, we can't predict the script, but I think we can create the mechanics. I think actually that's a responsibility as educators and as designers now, and then for those who are as old as me.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you. My name is Manuela. I'm a senior lecturer at in visual communication here. And thank you for your fantastic and really inspiring presentation. We've been talking here today too about, like this need. I love the fact that you talk about these anti-biographies, but also the danger of the universal design and that need for the multiplicity design and the multiple ways of cooking together, maybe. So one of the things that we've been talking here about is that need for changing the criteria for what we define as good design and design that is valuable and useful and actually valuable, yes. So how do we, and we don't have the answers either. It's something that we were discussing here today. How do we sort of enact this into education? How do we change design by changing education and vice versa to sort of find out what these new multiple, multiversal, pluriversal criteria for design can be?
Thank you for that question. I think so. When I talk about nomadic practices, so I do borrow some. I work with theories in posthumanism. I work with Deleuze and Guattari's ideas of nomadism, which is really this idea of working in a flat set of relations rather than, it sets up the opposition between, well, it's sort of more of a continuum between being nomadic and then those that versus settlements and those that create structures that are hierarchical. But I also utilize the notion of Donna Haraway's idea of situated knowledge. And situated knowledge, I think, is wonderful in the sense that it offers up ideas of, so in the sense of situated knowledge, is the shift toward those who, that knowledge, first of all, is embodied and situated rather than abstract and objective. And that the validity of knowledge really is who makes that claim and the integrity, the degree to which they are a part of what they're making, the situation in which that knowledge arises from, or the knowing arises from. And then this opens up to a set of differences that we can then accept that claim. And I add to this in terms of nomadic practices is who gathers, and not just who is in people, but what non-humans gather around that particular something to design that nomadic practice. So this could be anything. Anybody can make a claim and say, and a designer is not a designer in abstract. A designer always designs something. So someone can stand up and make a claim to say, I and we design something, and we can, and this is what we can. That, in a sense, is a robust. It's a useful. It's a actionable, I suppose. A way to think about the gathering, and then we can then think about how these nomadic practices, really where we gain is in the plurality, is collectively. We think across the nomadic practices, not the single practice that's going to lead us there, not the single universal design education that's going to lead us there. So I think if we can open up space for that in our education, and I think also we can think about this in global terms, I think that there's an increasing homogeneity across all the different design schools. And design curricula. And I think there's a need to kind of have this international accreditation, and I understand that. But I think we overlook perhaps some of the regional specific indigenous ways of knowing that can be brought into design practices that create these necessary differences. I see Marcus at the podium, so I'm gonna stop there.
I do have the unfortunate role throughout the day of trying to bring it to a close, which is really unfortunate because these discussions and the conversations are really important. I did want to add a comment though, because it does remind me of a conversation I had a couple of years ago with Geraldine Fitzpatrick, who's in Vienna, and we were talking about ways to rebut the expectation in design that we have to build scale in the same way that the sciences do. You know, the sciences' big expectation is EMC square, generalizability, transferability. And oftentimes, and it pops up regularly, there is, in a way, the obligation that we have to do the same, or we have to demonstrate and flex the muscle of, you know, design as a science, to the extent that some people refer to this sub field of design science. But Geraldine had this interesting response to it. She said, one of the ways of demonstrating impact and scale is through traveling literacies, was, I think, her term. And I think it does resonate quite nicely with the nomadic practices, because as you're nomadic with regards to the design toolkit and design practices, you actually leave both the legacy of literacies around design practices with the participants that you've been engaging with, but you also collect more and more domain knowledge as you are working on different projects. So every time you use the design repertoire in connection with a different domain, you also enhance your own kind of experience. And so the pluriverse, or the pluralistic approach, comes from not the generalizability, but to actually increase the multiplicity of those experiences. Now, it's late in the day for us. It's still early there, but we are so grateful that you're able to join us. The book cover is still on the screen there. I'm sure that it will make its way as a textbook in some of our design classes, because it was a very, very inspiring talk. Please join me in thanking Ron for joining us today as our closing keynote.